Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how do the components of our motor system flexibly reorganize in response to task demands? How do we use information about performance errors, knowledge of results to search for new organizations? Do these processes involve the use of hardwired motor programs or softly assembled devices specific to the constraints associated with the individual and the task? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book. Yes, I've written a new book on skill acquisition called How We Learn to Move, a revolution in the way we coach and practice sports skills. It covers the ecological approach to skill from different angles, including practice design, the CLA, coaching, youth sports, designing technology, injury prevention, and using analytics. So I hope you will consider giving it a read. You can find the book on Amazon or by going to perceptionaction.com/book. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to look at two very important concepts in the ecological approach to perception action: task-specific devices and soft assemblies. To start off with, I want to look at Jeff Bingham's epic 1988 paper, which was nicely discussed in a blog post by Andrew Wilson a few years ago, link in the show notes. In his paper, Jeff essentially starts with the degrees of freedom problem, but he puts a bit of a different spin on it. Given the redundancy and complexity in what he calls the human action system, that is, the multiple possible solutions to a movement problem, how do we decide which to use? He really challenges the way Bernstein thought about things. In particular, Jeff argues that trying to use as a starting point the full human action system, that is, all the possible degrees of freedom in our muscles, joints, etc., and trying to understand how we achieve control over all of this, for example, by freezing some of the degrees of freedom, is the wrong way to go, because the system is just too large and complex. We can't possibly know all the available degrees of freedom we have to start with. Instead of starting with the whole human action system and trying to understand how it's used to achieve a particular task like throwing a ball, Jeff proposes that we go in the other direction. That is, we build our understanding of what is available in the whole system by studying how very specific tasks are achieved. For this, he introduces the concept of the task-specific device, which is the human action system organized to perform a specific task like throwing. These task-specific devices have some key features. 1. They are task-specific. Duh. In forming a task-specific device, we're essentially reducing the complexity of the whole human action system so that we can control it. With this, of course, comes a necessary loss in the flexibility in some way. But critically, how we reduce the system and control it depends on the specific constraints of the task we're trying to achieve. There are no general-purpose devices. Number 2, a task-specific device is smart. By smart, Jeff is referring to Runson's concept of the smart perceptual mechanism, which I discussed back in episode 362. One of the key features of a smart mechanism is that it takes advantage of local shortcuts. That is, information that is created by the specific constraints of a task. Imagine there's a new sport out there called Roboball, where your task is to try and get a hit off a robot pitcher that throws the ball exactly 105 miles an hour on each pitch. A smart perceptual system would use the distance or the angular size of the ball to time the swing because it's a shortcut created by the constraints of this task. This is, of course, why we want to add variability to practice. We don't want to encourage the development of mechanisms that are smart in practice with overly restricted constraints and then dumb in the game, where the same shortcuts will no longer work. Number 3, a task-specific device is softly assembled. This is the other main concept I wanted to get into today. Because in life we just don't perform one task, the human action system needs to have multiple task-specific devices that share many of the same resources. My hip joint involved in the swinging of a baseball bat is also going to be needed to use to run after I hit the ball. For this reason, we do not have single-purpose devices that can only ever do one thing. Instead, to solve a task, we temporarily pull together degrees of freedom to create a task-specific device. When we switch to another task, this device can easily be broken apart and the parts reassembled into a different device, using some of the same and different degrees of freedom. Softness is critical. Because we have multiple redundant degrees of freedom, we need to be able to pull them apart and repurpose them if we want to take advantage of them. If they were rigidly linked in a hard assembly, we could not achieve this. Number 4, a task-specific device is controlled and stable. One way to conceptualize this is the development of an attractor, possibly temporarily, in a certain place in state space. Number 5, this is important but tricky. Task-specific devices are assembled over the properties of both the organism and their environment. Our bodies have dynamics, and so do things in the external environment, like a moving ball. Control comes from coupling these in a task-specific device such that it's better to think of them as one whole dynamical system, instead of the actor and the environment separately. Number 6, to perform a different task, we can switch to a different task-specific device, or it's possible that we could modify the existing one we are using if there's enough overlap with the new task we want to perform. This fits nicely with what we know about the specificity of transfer and the concept of donor sports. If, as a coach, you want to try and get an athlete to do something new, an effective way to achieve it can be to describe the goals in terms of something familiar they're already doing, thus creating the possibility of modifying an existing task-specific device. So, a task-specific device is not just referring to perception or action, it is a perception-action system. Thinking about it this way, there are two problems that the system must solve in linking the dynamics of the organism with the dynamics of the outside world. The first is identification. The dynamics of the world need to be specified in the optic array. This is, of course, what Gibson was all on about. Dynamical events in our environment, like an approaching ball or a ball carrier trying to get away from us, create structure in the optic array in specific ways to create specific information about action-relevant variables, like direction and time to contact. The second problem is one of scaling. The information specified in the optic array is incredibly powerful, but it arrives in units that are not really useful for the control of action. What am I supposed to do with the information that an object will arrive in 3 seconds or the ground is 35 degrees below my line of sight? The information we receive needs to be converted to some action-relevant scale. Instead of seconds away, we can perceive an approaching object in terms of our movement time, achieving action scaling. And instead of perceiving something as so many degrees below the line of sight, we can perceive it in terms of eye heights, achieving body scaling. As Jeff points out, this scaling relies on commonalities between the dynamics of the environment and the dynamics of the body. For example, the force of gravity has the same effect on our hand as it does on a ball. There's a lot more to task-specific devices than I've covered here. Check out Jeff's paper if you're interested. Next, I want to consider how the soft assembly and the reassembly of task-specific devices might occur by looking at a paper from Kello and Van Orden. They first lay out the traditional information processing approach to this problem. Quote, "Our current focus is on how components flexibly reorganize in response to task demands. One answer implicit in some explanations is that executive control processes, or homunculi, must direct coordination of components. Each particular chain may correspond to a sensorimotor program, for instance, and control processes select among programs and execute them. The well-known problem with this answer is that it merely shifts the burden of explanation onto control processes and begs the question of the origins of specialized processes. But this logic also immediately runs into the problem that component functions have many-to-many relationships with neuroanatomical pathways. On the one hand, a given function can be implemented in a number of different ways, as evidenced by the remarkable plasticity of biological organisms to re-implement functions when pathways are damaged or otherwise unavailable. On the other hand, any given pathway is involved in many direct functions if we define functions at the organism level or human behavior. Thus, many-to-many relationships makes it difficult to localize functions inside fixed components of neural hardware. It is more intuitive for functions to span neural and bodily components, where each component may play different roles to varying degrees of time. The transience of component roles makes functions appear as changing patterns of neural and behavioral activity." End quote. You can see within this quote the point that I keep making. Using internal mental models to explain the control of action is just shifting the problem around, from the human being to the controller inside the head, without actually solving it. The alternative, as the authors describe, is a soft assembly, in which components are coordinated and configured by virtue of their properties, interaction, and context, not through some high-level controller. Quote, The word soft in soft assembly denotes the capacity to form temporary organizations specific to task and context that may also reorganize to suit changing task demands. The word also serves to contrast with the notion of hard assembled functions, that is, functions whose particular neuroanatomical components are dedicated to play fixed specific roles. End quote. As an example of how this occurs, the authors point to examples of relative coordination. For example, phase relationships between different parts of the body. Quote, a classic illustration is that of a parent and child walking hand in hand. There will be a tendency for strides to be in phase, but strides also fall out of phase because the longer legs of the taller parent have a lower preferred frequency than the short legs of the child. The result is strides that are in phase for some periods of time, but that also drift into other phase relations depending on frequency ratios and extraneous factors. That is, there are intermittent periods of in-phase strides. Relative coordination is the hypothesized basis for soft assembly of locomotion in animal models like the centipede. The functionality of relative coordination can be further illustrated in the centipede. Centipedes crawl by oscillating their legs in traveling ways that move along their length from anterior to posterior. By varying phase relationships among legs over time, a spatial temporal pattern of leg activity is generated that satisfies locomotive needs of the centipede as well as metabolic constraints on energy efficiency. Nevertheless, von Holst discovered that the different patterns do not require different motor schema. Each pattern will emerge in a context of appropriate constraints. To corroborate this idea, he selectively amputated the legs of centipedes, producing 4 or 6-legged creatures, and he observed how they coped with their new bodily constraints. Remarkably, centipedes recovered locomotive function almost immediately and engaged phase relationships of leg oscillations appropriate to 4 or 6-legged creatures. Particular coordinations are determined by the specific constraints in place, such as the number of working legs. The genome may contribute constraints that figure in these coordinations, but it does not contribute explicit motor schemas. The limb coordination of locomotion is generated by intrinsic dynamics and interactions among movement components. Locomotion is a soft assembled function. End quote. So soft assemblies arise from the interactions between our intrinsic dynamics and the constraints imposed upon us. There is nothing pre-programmed or hardwired. There are no special purpose parts to the body that do only one thing. The last paper I want to look at today is one published in 2018 by Pacheco and Newell, in which they investigated how we search for task-specific devices through the available coordination solutions. In particular, the authors were interested in how knowledge of results guides this search. The basic idea that has been proposed for a long time is that our movement through search space is directly proportional to the size of the error we make. We make a big error, we change our coordination solution a lot. We make a small error, we just tweak it. Pacheco and Newell build on this by bringing in constraints. Quote, to encompass these divergent pathways of change, we draw on the proposition that the relation between change and information observed in each task emerges from the confluence of organismic, environmental, and task constraints. Thus, when different task constraints are considered, new relations in the pattern of change might be observed. Specifically, the finding of proportional relationship between errors, knowledge of results, and change might be limited to parameter ranges of these variables in which the inherent variability of the system does not surpass the required change in outcome to meet the task goals. In tasks where the range is necessarily exceeded, new relations between knowledge of results and outcome change might be apparent, leading to discontinuities in the relationship over a sequence of practice trials. For instance, in throwing a ball to a close target, the individual modifies the parameters in close agreement with the outcome. If the ball was more to the left, change to the right. Now, if the distance to the target is large, small deviations at the beginning cause large deviations in the end, requiring a different type of search, probably dependent on other parameters. End quote. Essentially, what they're doing here is bringing in the idea of Bingham's task-specific device. Quote, the idea of a low-dimensional perceptual motor workspace, that is, where search is directly related to performance errors, can be derived from the concept of special task purpose devices, Bingham, and the open and nonlinear characteristics of the biological system that result in attractor states that can support the task at hand. In this view, the observed order in the output, in terms of movement outcome, for instance, occurs a posteriori. The observed pattern cannot be attributed to an a priori structure within the system. A consequence of this derivation is that the system can show a common pattern of organization between similar tasks, but slight changes in the tasks or other constraints might also change the stability of previously observed patterns, end quote. To test these ideas, the authors used a virtual throwing task in which the movement of participants' arm projected a virtual ball across a computer tablet. After each movement, the individual observed the simulated trajectory of the virtual object. The projector leaves the initial position at the bottom left corner of the screen and performs a parabolic motion towards the target. The participant was able to evaluate their error, the final distance from the target, to consider what he or she should change and implement on the next trial. There were 4 different conditions in the study which altered the distribution of errors in the perceptual landscape. The first condition, labeled as long linear, had the target at 26 centimeters and a proportional change in score from 0 to 100 in relation to the distance. This condition was selected as a standard comparison for others. The second condition, labeled as short linear, had the distance at 13 centimeters and a proportional change in score from 0 to 100. The rate of change in score was twice that of the long linear. The third condition, labeled as long accelerating, had the target at 26 centimeters and an accelerating change in error from 0 to 100 in relation to distance. The fourth condition, labeled as long decelerating, had the target at 26 centimeters and a decelerating change in error. So essentially, you can think about this as change in the consequences for different types of performance errors. In the second 2 conditions, the errors are going to be exponential, right? Slight misses are going to be exaggerated. Or another way of thinking about this is adding more or less inherent variability to the task. In accelerating conditions, there's more because small changes in your movement are going to lead to larger changes in errors. What was found? As the authors predicted, there was not a simple proportional relationship between the performance errors and search. That only really occurred in the short linear condition. Results from the other conditions show that the relationship depended on the variability profile of the task, indicating that participants are basing their search for a solution on specific task constraints. In other words, they're finding a task-specific device for the particular constraints of the condition. Quote, the results showed that the relationship between the changes from trial-to-trial movement outcome to performance level were dependent on the landscape of the task dynamics and the influence of inherent variability of the performer. Furthermore, the search was in constrained parameter regions of the perceptual motor landscape that depended on the task constraints. These findings show that there's not a single function of trial-to-trial change over practice, but rather local search strategies, proportional, discontinuous, constant, adapt to the level of performance and the confluence of constraints to action, end quote. The authors note that the present findings provide good evidence for the type of soft assembly task-specific devices we've been talking about today. Quote, in general, the present results support the interpretation that the current assumptions on trial-to-trial dynamics of change in the literature oversimplify the emergent relationship between information and change. Our results showed that not only the task constraints influence the pattern of trial-to-trial change, but also that different individuals reveal different dynamics as well. The findings showed that the system in the search acts on a restricted region of the task workspace. This supports the hypothesis of search strategies in which practice occurs as a function of inherent properties of the system. And the observed pattern is consistent with the proposition that the system works in terms of the task at hand as a special purpose device and solves the degrees of freedom problem in the task space in a similar manner as observed at the joint level of analysis, end quote. So in sum, there's evidence that we don't use hardwired special purpose mechanisms to control our actions in which certain parts of the perception action system are used for only one type of action. Instead, we softly assemble task-specific devices using multiple parts, some of which are used for devices for similar or even very different tasks. Thus, skill is not about pulling the correct, well-learned, heavily repeated motor action off the shelf at the right time. It's about being adaptive, being able to assemble parts that control the action on the fly to account for the specific constraints of the situation. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Gone through St. Louis.